Okay. Welcome, everybody. Really excited about today's presentation. I'd like to welcome Samaria King from Dreaming Out Loud. She's going to give us a 45-minute presentation, more or less, and then we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions. Please type in any questions you have in the chat box in the meantime, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Samaria.
Okay, can everyone see my screen? Thumbs up.
Yes, yes.
Okay. All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Samaria, and I am the farm director at Dreaming Out Loud, which is a nonprofit in Washington, D.C. We work on food justice and food access in D.C., specifically working in Ward 7 and Ward 8. And I manage the farm at Kelly Miller, which is a 2-acre urban farm in Northeast DC, located behind Kelly Miller Middle School. So today I'll be talking about garden planning and seasonality. I know you all are in the Master Gardener class and probably have some experience. So I'm also interested in just, getting an understanding of what people know, what they don't know, and if there's anything that folks are specifically interested in learning. So if you have any initial questions, feel free to pop them in the chat or, come off of mute and just share if there's anything you specifically would like to know. Otherwise, I can get into my presentation. So as I mentioned, the farm at Kelly Miller is a 2-acre urban farm, and we have been growing there since 2018, and we grow a variety of vegetables, fruits, and herbs. So these are some pictures from this year. We've started a medicinal herb garden this year. I'm also an herbalist, and this is a picture of our hoop house. So we are able to do season extension on site and grow a variety of different crops. This is just a few other photos. This is what our hoop house looked like last year. Last year was the first year that we had a hoop house, and we were able to grow peppers and watermelons in there last year. And then this year we've done a rotation of root vegetables and tomatoes. And then this is just a picture of some of the kale that we're growing this year. And I will say it has been a journey in starting a farm. The soils there are very high, have very high alkaline pH, which is not something that I had experienced before. And I came from another growing space that, I didn't start, that already had very rich soil. And so it's been a journey in learning how to work with the soil here. And every year is an opportunity for us to learn the growing site more and to plan out, what we're going to do to make our soil healthier and better and our crops stronger. And so that's a big process of our planning season. We grow a lot of compost, we produce a lot of compost on site. And we also do a lot of cover cropping and sheet mulching. The site that we're on has pretty poor drainage. We are on a flood zone. And so we've had to do a lot of work to really build up the soil. This year, our strategy has been to do sheet mulching. If you don't know, sheet mulching is when you kind of create like a layering lasagna layer on top of your soil. And so in the wintertime for us, we had identified the areas on the farm that we had seen just weren't doing well. They weren't producing crops well. And the soil there was really kind of sinking down throughout the year. And so what we did is we put cardboard down. You know, a lot of people were getting packages last year. And so we were lucky that a lot of folks brought us their cardboard boxes. And we made sure to take up any of the like tape or any plastic or anything on those boxes. And we laid those down on the soil. And then we took either straw or leaves and kind of layered it on top of the cardboard box. And then we took the compost that we had produced on site and put that compost on top of that straw or on top of those leaves. And then once we did that, we planted our cover crop into it. And that worked really, really well for us. I wish I had pictures to show you. But what happened is that it raised the soil up a lot, creating that sheet mulch, that lasagna mulch. And then we were able to really create this kind of like ecosystem underneath the cardboard of worms and other bugs that came in, because there was now this like nice, moist, warm environment with a lot of roots from this cover crop that we were using. And I like to use the cover crop from Johnny's Seeds, the fall cover crop, which is a mixture of like hairy vetch, rye, peas, and oats, I believe. And so they're all doing different things. Some of them may be able to grow throughout the whole winter. Some, you know, may die at the first frost, but it creates like a good biomass and really created this nice environment in these areas. And so once we allowed our cover crop to grow over the winter, and over the winter, our staff produced more compost. We get food scraps from DC Central Kitchen and Compost Cab and from our neighbors. And so it was our mission to try and compost as much as possible over the winter. One person said, when did you plant the cover crop? So I like to plant my cover crop when I'm done with my last crop in whatever section that I'm growing in. Typically the kind of the last window of time of putting a cover crop in for where we live is like the beginning of November. And that would be like a winter rye, something that's like pretty hardy and can still germinate in really kind of cold temperatures. But I think a kind of a good window of time is probably starting in September. You know, maybe you're taking some of your summer crops out and you're not going to plant any fall crops there, and you can get some cover crop in then. And then again, the last time would be around November. And so once we you know, made a lot of compost over the winter time. And then once we were ready to start planting based on our crop plan, we had to look back and see how much time would it take for us to kill that cover crop, you know, let it decompose, and then, you know, form our beds. We also had the plan of really raising up our beds this year by digging out furrows in our walkways. And so over the past 3 seasons, we've been putting wood chip mulch down in our pathways. And so now that has created this kind of like nice, rich environment. You know, people walk over it, it's decomposing. And so our plan was, you know, in the areas where maybe we didn't do this whole sheet mulch, but we still cover cropped, to dig out our pathways and build up the soil and build up our beds so that they were really high so that they could withstand, you know, any kind of flooding. And then in the sections where we had sheet mulch, we used something called silage tarp. Silage tarp is something that a lot of more like farmers are using nowadays as they're doing this no-till method to kill their cover crop without having to really kind of like till it in. And so a silage tarp is like a big thing of plastic, and it's black on one side and white on the other. And basically it solarizes the cover crop underneath it. And in the wintertime, it can take about 6 to 8 weeks to break that cover crop down underneath. And then in the summertime, like right now, they say it should take about 3 weeks. And so we had to really kind of work backwards and say, okay, you know, we know that we want to get stuff planted, let's say by April 1st. So we have to work backwards, 2 months really to get started in putting our silage chart down, checking it on a regular basis to make sure things are dying underneath it. And then we need enough time to do that bed preparation so that we can plant our crops. And for us, that bed prep looks like, adding compost and adding soil amendments. I did mention that our soil has a really high pH. And so we have to add what is called like an elemental sulfur to our soil to kind of bring the pH down. We have a pretty, we have a good amount of nutrients in our soil, but they're locked up in the soil because our pH is so high. So that's just kind of a little overview of what we did this year to really kind of prep our growing space. And now I'll kind of get into my presentation and the planning process that it took to get to that point for us. Just check the chat. Okay. Someone asked, when do you take up the silage chart? You do no tillage. So we take up the silage chart once we see that the cover crop underneath is almost all the way decomposed or decomposed enough where we can kind of just like rake it up. And it's not too moist underneath there. You do have to take it off and make sure that the soil kind of dries up so you're not working with wet soil. But the ideal is that you just pull that silage tarp off and everything is completely decomposed under there and you have a nice stale seed bed. And that really just kind of depends on your timeline and how much time you have to let that silage tarp sit. In some of our areas, we didn't see that. There was still some plant debris underneath there. And then in other sections, which I'll go back to for where this herb bed is right here on the left, I pulled that silage tarp off. There was nothing underneath. It was easy to plant right into it. But we had put our cover crop down there, pretty early. And because we were planting herbs, which, we didn't have to start until probably May, we had more time than we did for, let's say, our kale. Let's see. So, I'm just going to check the chat. Okay, so one person asked, should the cardboard be shredded first or literally just lay down? You just want to lay it down. You don't have to shred it. What I really like about the cover crop is that it helps with the process of breaking that cardboard down. It may not break down all the way. You may see like some remnants of that cardboard there, but if you have enough time, if you, allow yourself enough time, you should see it, completely break down and there be no remnants left. And so, I am a nonprofit farmer, which means that I farm all year, and then in the wintertime, I have to do a lot of like planning and a lot of meetings. And so the winter is a really great time for me and my staff to reflect upon our season, to talk about what we thought went well, what we thought didn't go well, and kind of bring together all of the ideas that maybe we mentioned or were thinking about during the year and, put them on paper and try and implement them. And so, there's, I think, many different ways kind of depending on the way you like to plan and the way you like to process things for you to plan out your garden. In this picture right here, you can see that this person has laid out their garden on paper. This is one of my friends, Susanna. She is an off-grid farmer in Kentucky, lives on the side of a mountain and has been farming there for at least 20 years. She has no, everything is solar power, composting toilets. And so for her, she doesn't have a computer. It's easier for her, to write out her crop plan. And you can see that she's color coded it here. And so when I was there last, this section that was green was corn and beans and squash. And then this other section right here where you can kind of see like the red and the pink was a mixture of different crops. And so I thought, this is really great, especially if you're a visual person and you want to see a map of your space. This is a beautiful way to plan out your crops and your crop rotation. And then maybe you just keep this in a notebook so you can refer back to it year to year. I think another good thing, if you have the time, is to keep a journal of everything, the things that you notice, the pests that you notice, the time that those pests arrive, the time that those pests go away. Maybe you notice that this year has been a pretty dry season, but the year before was pretty rainy. And you write that down in your notebook every year and just start to kind of see patterns in the weather and the way things are. I think it's also helpful to reflect to see, what grew well for you. I'll say the first year that I started out at this farm, as I mentioned before, I came from a space where we could kind of just grow anything. And so I was really used to being able to grow whatever and not having to really think about the soil. And so my first year there, I grew a whole bunch of things that I was used to growing. And then I realized I can't grow all this stuff here. The soil here, it's not going to work. I was trying to grow potatoes and corn and just things that I had seen do really well. And the soil where I am now was like, no, we're not doing it. And so I identified those few crops that I noticed that did well there, which were like cucumbers, bush beans, strawberries, okra, kale, collards, and lettuce. And so the next year, that's what I focused on. I took out the potatoes, I took out the corn, I took out the kind of like heavy feeders, like watermelons, and I really focused on growing these things that I recognize that did well. And so I really think of gardening as an opportunity to continuously be learning and growing, that it's a lifelong journey of really, understanding, how plants work and developing a relationship with them. And that, you're never going to get it right. But it's a learning experience and it's fun and it's a joyful thing. And to not put too much pressure on yourself because things always change from year to year. And so when you're, starting your garden, maybe you've already been growing for a while, or maybe you're just starting out. But these are a few things to kind of think about. And so, what do you like to eat? Are you growing tomatoes, but you hate tomatoes? Do you like to eat watermelons? Do you like to eat bush beans? Do you like to eat collard greens? What are the things that you really like to eat and things that would bring you joy in growing? Or, do you like herbs? Do you just want to start with herbs, or do you just want to start with flowers? Like, what are the things that you feel like would make you happy and really kind of invest in your garden? And then how much time do you have? Are you able to go out to your garden every day? Is it close to where you live? Do you have to drive an hour? I know I have to commute an hour to get to work now. I live in Maryland. So how, what is your distance to the space that you are growing? And then what is your climate or your growing zone? I'm guessing most people are here in Maryland or in DC, and so we're in zone 7, but maybe you are moving somewhere else and they have a completely different climate than the one that you're used to. It's important to figure that out and get an understanding of what that climate is like. I know I was just up in Vermont with herbalists, and we were talking about our greens, and they were so surprised that here you have to take your greens out in the summertime because of pests. But for them, you know, they can grow their greens all year round, and they were shocked that I couldn't grow my greens all year round. But they also have a much shorter growing season. So, you know, when we're able to put stuff in the ground, they're still dealing with snow. So you really have to think about those things and think about your space. And then how much space do you have? You know, do you have a lot of space, but you're just starting out, you know, maybe you want to start out small, a few raised beds, you know, a little section in ground, and then kind of work your way up as you get more comfortable with what you're doing. I know last year for us was a year we were able to expand our growing because we were in a pandemic and we were no longer, you know, doing field trips or having volunteer groups and having a lot of people come to the farm. And so all of a sudden we had a lot more time. And that allowed us to open up a lot more growing space on the farm and grow more crops than we have been able to in the past. And then, you know, do you want to start your own seeds? Hold on, I have a baby. She was coming downstairs. Okay. So do you want to start your own seeds, or do you want to have someone else grow them for you?
This popsicle is ruined.
It's okay. I know that I don't necessarily have the time to start my own seeds. And so I have someone else start them for me. But maybe that's something that you're passionate about and that's something that you want to do. And so you have to factor that into your planning for the season. All right. So I went over this. So, you know, make a list of the crops that you want to grow. Figure out, are you going to just be gardening on the weekends? Do you have a few days during the week that you can dedicate to this? As I mentioned, you know, figure out what zone you're in, kind of measure out your growing space. I'll say I'm out in Maryland and my partner and I are starting to farm out here. And so, you know, in the winter time, we went out, you know, with a measuring tape to kind of just walk the property and kind of measure out, you know, the space that we wanted to grow and kind of divvy it up. I want to grow herbs. He wants to grow like storage crops. So we decided whose side was who, how much space we each wanted, and then we were able to plan from there what we wanted to grow. So you can see from this map, this is the USDA plant hardiness zone map. And we are right over here where it is green. So we would be 7 or 6. As I was mentioning before, you can see up here where Vermont and New Hampshire and Maine are. That is a little bit colder. That would be like the 5 or the 4. And then, the further south you go is around 12. I was just in Puerto Rico, and they are growing a whole different, kind of crops down there. And even the things that are similar to what we grow up here look different because it's warm all year round. So, they had oregano that really looks like a bush. The leaves were much smaller. They had a Tulsi or holy basil that I had never seen before. The flowers looked different. The plant was kind of purple. They had a lot of like lemon trees and lime trees and banana trees. And you'll see that people try and grow those things here, but because it's not warm enough, we don't get the fruit. An example of that is one of my coworkers, Mr. Hill. He loves to grow lemon and lime trees. And that is his passion. He loves doing it, but he's not able to get any fruit from it because our climates aren't warm enough. And so you just really see those differences as you travel and see other people's growing space. And then an important thing is seasonality. I'm sure, as gardeners, you all have an understanding of this, but I have noticed that, for many people starting out, you don't always have an understanding of when to grow what. So maybe, I taught a class a few months ago, and, it was maybe like April, and the person was already had tomato plants and was trying to put them in the ground, but we were going to get another frost. And so it's just really important to have an understanding of when things are ready to go in the ground, when things are ready to be harvested, so that you're not planting things at the wrong time and expecting things to be ready and they're not, or they're not able to survive. Oh yeah, we are in zone 7. So what's in season? So we're lucky here that we're able to basically have 3 seasons of growing. And so the things that are in the springtime are, I think of just as like the brassicas and the root crops, right? Kale, collards, cabbage, broccoli, spinach, radishes, turnips, peas, Swiss chard, things that can withstand the cooler temperatures. They really like the cooler temperatures. They're like a little bit more like succulent and sweet in cooler temperatures. And then, they don't really like the heat. Like kale, I still have some kale in the ground, but it's tough. It's a lot tougher. The bugs are getting to it. It's not as happy now that it is so warm. And then our summer crops. I like to think of this as like, what do I see at the farmer's market, in the middle of the summer? What are you like the most excited about when it becomes summertime? And those are the things that you can grow in the summer. And so those are like your tomatoes, cucumbers, beans, okra, watermelons, strawberries, peaches. I will note that for the onions and the garlic, right, we do plant those in colder temperatures. So you can plant your onions in March and you plant your garlic in October, but they just take a really long time. And that's when you can start to harvest those things. And then again, in the fall and the winter time, you add in things like the winter squash. You're now able to harvest your sweet potatoes because you planted them in the summertime, and you can have pumpkins and you can have broccoli, grow broccoli a lot easier probably in the fall because they need so much more time and they like that cooler weather a lot better. And then I really like this chart. It's something that I was introduced to early on in my, growing career, I guess. And I've just found it really helpful to see this and visualize when to plant what. And I'm sure they probably have it for the different zones, but it's a really kind of handy thing to have. One of the questions was, How do you advise bringing an understanding of seasonality to non-gardeners such as CSA clients? I think it's really helpful to have that in like your introduction about your CSA. You know, maybe you're giving out information or you have like a customer agreement that you send out in the beginning of the season. I know that I've done that in the past to kind of just explain to people that first of all, you know, maybe some of the things they get, you know, if you're growing sustainably or organically, are going to have a few holes in it from the bugs, and that also that there's going to be a mixture of stuff that they'll get throughout the season. That, you know, the things that we see in the grocery store year round don't grow here year round. You know, they're coming from other countries, they're being imported, and they're different. And so I would just, you know, take the time in the beginning while you're doing your advertisement to really try and educate your customers about, you know, the differences in, you know, what you can grow here and what you can get here versus what you get at the grocery store.
The grocery store?
Mhm.
Okay.
All right. And I think there was another question. Okay. Then the other question was, if potatoes are planted in May, when are they harvested? So you should start to be able to harvest your potatoes like once the plants have flowered and they're starting to die back is when you should be able to harvest them. So I know we've already started harvesting some of our potatoes. We still have some plants in the ground, but you can basically kind of like dig around the base of your plant and kind of check to see. But just similar to onions, once you see the plant start to die back is when you're able to start harvesting those. All right. So this is from a book. I really like this when I'm just thinking about, you know, planning out my my crop plan for the year, is to know, you know, all of this information, when things germinate, what is the best time to put stuff in the ground, what is their hardiness. This even has like plants per person. And then your planting facts and your harvest facts. So I really like to kind of do that research ahead of time and put those notes, you know, either in my journal or in my spreadsheets.
Are we supposed to pick up jobs 6?
No.
Oh.
So that I have all of that information all ready and ready to go. All right. And then to sow or not to sow, you know, what should you be planting directly in the ground? What should you be transplanting, and what can you kind of get away with doing either or? This is my personal list of things that I've seen, you know, do better when I directly sow them versus transplanting or vice versa. But I'm also curious to see, you know, from you all, if you have experienced something different, or if you have particular things that you like to sow directly in the ground or transplant, or if you've seen can, you know, do either. So feel free to drop that in the chat. I know that, you know, a lot of farmers in our region like to start their peas and transplant them because they can get them in the ground a little bit earlier. And I've also seen farmers transplant their okra. That's not something that I like to do. I like to plant those peas in the ground, and I like to plant okra in the ground, but I have seen folks do it that way. Linda said they transplanted beets, carrots, spinach, and okra. Barbara said, I've tried transplanting peas and they did not do well, but okra did well. Yeah, I feel like the peas kind of just like fall over. They're just not as happy as when you are just directly planting them in the ground. See, can you get one for Junior? And then something that I've tried out this year, that I was really an investment was getting the Jang cedar. I worked with the Earthway cedar in previous years, which just didn't do well. And a lot of other farmers I know have the Jang, and I used it on another farm that I was working at. It's called the Jang. I can type it in the chat. It's this like beautiful cedar that has perfect spacing, and you don't have to, thin anything out. I planted my Hackerite turnips and beets with it this year, and they just were amazing. I didn't have to thin anything. Yeah, it's something that you push. You just kind of push it along the ground, and it has different like seed plates, and you just put your seeds in there. You have to get the different seed plates that will fit, the size of your seed. And so that's something I didn't realize when I got it. I bought like a standard pack, but like you really have to look and figure out the ones that work well with the seeds that you have. But that has really kind of, changed things for us on the farm. So I'm not sure if it would work well in a raised bed, but it's definitely if you're growing in the ground. It's, and you don't, you feel you're producing a lot of food, maybe you're doing like an urban farm, you're feeding people, and you don't have the time to try and thin things or plant things by hand. It's a really good thing to invest in, and I think it lasts a pretty long time as well. For some things though, I really like to plant them by hand. Like beans, I really like to plant beans by hand. Kind of the larger things, peas, I kind of like to take my time and plant those things by hand, as opposed to trying to use the Jang. So it really just depends. But for those smaller seeds like the turnips, it's much better. Somebody said, can you address when it's best to plant in the ground and when in a raised bed and soil quality in DC? So I think the first thing would be to get a soil test. That can really help you to determine if the soil quality, if you're trying to plant things in ground in DC and you're kind of worried about the urban soils, getting a soil test will let you know, whether it's possible or not to even try. And then from there, I think it's really just about like accessibility, and how much, kind of like how much upfront labor you're trying to put in. Growing in ground, if your soil quality is poor, is going to take a lot of work to really address those issues. Personally, I like growing in the ground. I've done both. And I've seen it work differently for different crops. I found that like melons can do really, really well in a raised bed. I've grown greens in a raised bed. Things that I've seen that have not done that great, or at least for like the structure of the raised bed, was like sweet potatoes. We grew sweet potatoes in a raised bed, and they just got so big, and the raised beds were kind of old that they just kind of started to like push them apart. So it just kind of depends on, the structure, the quality of the structure that you're growing in. On the farm, we do have different sections of growing spaces. So we have like our main production field where everything is in the ground, but then we have senior beds and we have a youth garden. And the senior beds are pretty big. They're really kind of raised up so that, people don't have to bend over really far to plant anything. You can use them as seeding. And we can just fill those with our own soil, and kind of, make sure that the soil quality is good, and replenish that soil every year. For the youth garden, the raised beds are much lower to the ground because they're for kids. So they're easy for the kids to access, to plant in, to water. And so I think just kind of thinking about all of those things when you're deciding is important. And then again, how much space do you want to use? Okay, some person, Barbara said raised beds can be soil brought in or areas that you brought up the way you described with the lasagna method, adding wood chips. So I'm often confused when people refer to raised beds. Okay. Yeah, so raised beds, yeah, are either like the boxes, right? Like your wooden boxes. But then what you grow in the ground is called like your bed, right? And so you can raise them up. I wish I had a picture to show you of what our in-ground beds look like. But because we dug the pathways out, they're much like higher than you would see. Let's see if I have a picture. So these are like growing beds, right? But they're pretty flat. You can see that the ground, the pathways are pretty level with the beds. Kind of the same here. But if
Can I just say, if it's okay? Yeah, so sometimes when people say raised beds, so that technically just means where you have a wooden structure where you've brought in soil from the outside and created this soil on top of the existing soil. But like if what you're doing is what you've done, which is to create these elevated beds, that's still considered to be in ground, because that's what I've done. I've created these elevated beds, but with no outside soil. I've just like put in leaves and mulch and, and then put the soil back on top and then compost on top. So it kind of created a raised bed. Yeah. That's not considered a raised bed because it's still more in ground.
Yes, correct.
Thank you.
Yeah. Another person said, can you use the lasagna method cover crops for raised beds, or is it not necessary? I don't think it would be necessary to do that, but you definitely could plant cover crops in your raised beds. And then just, I would maybe do like ones that could winter kill if you don't want to have to go through the process of killing your cover crop. All right, so I'm gonna we're almost at the 45-minute mark. So I really like this little chart, the legume, root, fruit, leaf chart. It helps when I'm doing my crop plan to kind of keep this in mind. And then another thing that I think about is the days to maturity. So how long does it take from putting that seed in the ground to when I can harvest it? It varies based on when you are starting your crop. So, maybe that 55 to 60 days for okra will take a little bit longer if you're trying to germinate it at 70 degrees instead of, the 75 or even up to the 90. So those are just all things to consider when you are putting together your crop plan. This is just a picture to show you the progression. This is my daughter right here who was just on the screen planting kale last year. This is right as like the pandemic was hitting and there was no more school. So she was at work with me, helping me out. And then you can see what these kale look like by June 1st. And, this is our farm last year. I got a new phone, so I didn't have a lot of pictures to show you all of this year. But these are the beds that we kind of really have raised up. And if you have the opportunity, we would love to have you come and check out the space and have a tour. I really like to do things in person and get a hands-on. Another question was, do you have to manage for deer or other critters? In DC, for the most part, we don't. We're lucky if you can kind of see in this picture in the back, there's a really high fence. And we've only had a few instances where, there's been a hole in the fence and some deer have gotten in. Last year, the deer were eating our sweet potato leaves, but that was kind of it. And we don't really have any like groundhogs or any issues like that, which is very lucky. At other places I have had groundhogs, and you have you're not supposed to do this, but you have to catch them and, you know, release them somewhere else. But I'm not telling you to do that. And then I think our biggest pests, we have like woods right next to us. So our biggest issues are like the cabbage moths and like harlequin beetles and aphids and stuff like that. Another question was, can you give some advice on plant rotation annually, plants in the same family? So yeah, our rule of thumb is, we go back to this chart right here, is to try and not to plant things in the same family for at least 3 years. And so that's why I try and follow this if I can. I won't say that it always works out, but it's a good thing to kind of keep in mind as you're planning, so that you can try and keep things out of the same place. You definitely want to make sure that you're not growing anything in like the brassica family in the same place for at least 3 years. I've also seen stuff like spinach and beets. Those are in the same family, so making sure that you're not planting those crops in the same place. And that would kind of, you would have to really kind of zero in on that with this legume root leaf fruit, because beets are a root, spinach are a leaf. So just making a note of that in that original or in the crop plan that I showed you in the front, you know, she had all the plant families. And so it's important to kind of write that out in your notes so that you're sure. Other things, like I have planted carrots in the same place 2 years in a row and it was okay. So mainly I really try and, you know, make a point of not putting brassicas in the same place, and the beets and spinach, and then anything in the Solanaceae family as well. Using for pest control. Okay, another question is, what product are you using for pest control? So we use like row fabric. Last year we invested in the Protect Net insect netting, and it's another thing that's like kind of pricey, but I think if used properly, it is worth it, and it can be reused from year to year. Doing the rotation is helpful for us, making sure that over the winter time we take everything out of the ground. We don't leave anything over the winter time that could like harbor pests. And then we try and stay on top of things. When we do see pests, we take our time to go through, you know, each plant, check the leaf, you know, check for eggs, check for worms or whatever it is, and just kind of kill everything by hand. That has been my method of trying to keep things at bay. And then if I've noticed that something is like really bad, I won't compost it. I'll dispose of things offsite. Another question was, do you use BT? I've tried to use it. My really like strategy has just been to like focus on the soil health, because if I have happier plants that aren't stressed out, they're less likely to be attacked by pests. So I try and stay away from using anything if I can, and really, yeah, again, just focus on working on the soil. And I found, especially this year, our soil last year was like really waterlogged. And that was like really stressing the plants out, and pests were getting to them. And so again, really kind of raising up the soil for us has been super helpful. And, you know, even as we've seen pests, the plants have been much sturdier and much more able to withstand the pests. Another question is, are you using companion planting in the garden? For me, it really varies from year to year. The first year I was there, I did a bunch. I did like okra and watermelon and like tomatoes and basil and lemongrass. I really wanted to try a bunch of stuff. I've done like nasturtiums and cucumbers. But as the years have gone on, I've focused a little bit more on just doing one crop at a time. I do have extensive like pollinator borders on the farm to create habitat for beneficial bugs. And I've seen that is also working. We have a lot of wasps on the farm this year, and they're doing the work for us of going around and checking all the collard greens and the kale greens for bugs. And so I think just for us, like investing in that habitat for beneficial pollinators and beneficial bugs has been helpful for us. We have done a little bit of companion planting or intercropping with our tomatoes this year. We have some basil and some eggplant with our tomatoes. But that's about it for us this year. Let's see, okay. So this is really my last slide that I wanted to show you all. This is kind of just like a mock-up of what our crop plan looks like. So you can see I have, based on what was in this location last year, I have my suggested planting for 2020. And so my location, field A, I have all of my fields broken up into different letters. And then within that letter, each bed is a number. And so I've tried more and more to kind of grow things in blocks, so it makes it easier to do crop rotation. When I started, maybe I had tomatoes here and collards here and peas here and just a whole bunch of stuff all next to each other. And so more and more, I've really tried to kind of scale up and do these planting blocks together to make it easier for me to plan. And so you can see here, we had a fall cover crop in where our lettuce was. We were able to, cut that cover crop down, put the silage tarp over it, and get all those, beds prepped so that we could plant by April 1st. And as I mentioned, we get our transplants grown by someone else. We get them from Sharp's farm. And so, I do my crop plan probably in like December-ish. And so I know that by January, I can send them an email and say, hey, here are all the things that I need, and I need them by this date. And so I have the DTM here, the days to maturity. And so, if this lettuce takes about 55 days, I can guesstimate that the harvest date, based on getting these as a transplant that have already been growing for about 30 days, will only take another like 20 or so days to be ready. And then I'll be able to start harvesting them around the end of April. This lettuce right here is like a cut and come again lettuce. And so I know I'll get a few harvests out of it, maybe at least 2. I'll harvest them at different times. And so that window that they'll be in the ground, could even be up, a month up after this harvest date. I didn't go into detail for the summer stuff because I wanted to show you all something else in my notes, is that I also like to just put notes in. And so I've been growing bush beans, for a while, and I've always picked these provider bush beans. But I've noticed that they do really well if I plant them really early. Like I planted them in April last year, and they did great. I had them under the row cover. They produced a lot of beans. But then as it got hotter, they started to kind of wilt, and they were unhappy, and they weren't germinating well. And so this year, I made sure I did my research to find a variety of bush beans that likes warmer weather. And so I picked these jade bush beans and have done this in like a succession planting. So, if this is an earlier lettuce, a head lettuce, I'm able to get out of the ground. Then I can plant 2 rows of these provider bush beans while it's still pretty cool outside. I'll wait a little bit longer. Maybe this is a mixed lettuce. I'll wait a little bit longer for that in the ground. And then I can plant my jade bush beans. Every succession planting of my bush beans will be jades until it's a little bit cooler, and then I can put those providers back in the ground. Another thing, as I mentioned before, is we planted Hackeri turnips this year in our hoop house. And we planted those, around April 1st. They're a really quick one. They only take 38 days. And so we had a pretty good harvest, and doing them with the Jang cedar meant that we didn't have to thin everything out. And we had nice big bulbs. And then because those were so quick, I could put tomatoes in there. And I got those tomatoes from transplant, from the same folks, Sharps. I put my order in with them for the spring and summer at the same time. So they have my whole list and can start things from when I need them. And then, based on the type that we're growing, which is the sun golds, which is the indeterminate, and then the Romas, which are the determinate. Then in my notes, I can say, okay, we need to trellis these ones. We don't need to trellis these. And then because I have that information, my staff, can do the research, can do the work of figuring out, what supplies we need to trellis these, what will work, what do we have to trellis, what do we not, what do we have to prune, what do we not. And then when I'm finished, or when these things are finished, I will give the soil a break, and I'll, put a cover crop in, and just let things rest. Maybe in the hoop house, I want to be able to grow some stuff a little bit earlier or in the winter time. So I will do like a quick cover crop in there. But if I determine that, the soil really needs a rest, it's not worth it to me to kind of try and stuff in three rounds of crops in there if it makes more sense for me to give it a break. And then my last slide is just to show you our hoop house. And this is a way to be able to do season extension. This picture on the left is what it looked like in the beginning before we grew anything in it. And then this was what it looked like last year when we first started to do peppers. Our peppers did really well in there. And we did watermelons. We did an experiment. We did some watermelons outside, and we did some watermelons in the hoop house just to see, which ones did better. And we found that the ones outside did better. And I think it's because they got a little bit more of the rain and kind of, the whole like cycle of nature, where you don't get that in the hoop house. You're just, having your irrigation in there. I'm gonna look in the chat. Let's see. So someone said, so you're harvesting tomatoes now. Yeah, our sun golds are just starting to ripen. And then another question was, what are your thoughts on pruning tomatoes? So I will say we are pruning ours this year. Our sun golds can get really wild. And so I think it's worth it for us to try and prune them and kind of have one stalk kind of growing up and have them trellis. I think some people, everybody feels different about what they think you should do. I was away for a little while and I came back, and I had been teaching my staff how to prune the tomatoes, but it's a little bit confusing at first. You can't really see those like suckers in there. And so some people had been pruning the leaf and not the sucker. And so then there were these huge like offshoots of new tomato plants growing. And so I just went in there, and they had tomatoes on them and everything. And I just went in there and I just pruned them all. And maybe a few years ago, I wouldn't have been able to do that. But I've just learned that sometimes it's better to make those choices so that you can reap the benefits in the long run. That's another thing I've learned with growing strawberries. It's tricky to try and pluck off all those flowers the first year because you want the strawberries the first year. But if you pluck them off, you'll get a great harvest the second year. And so you have to make those decisions. you know, when you're in the garden.
So Samaria, sorry, we're just coming up to 7 o'clock now. So I think one last question, and then I think we have to wrap up.
So the last question is, the Jang cedar is pricey, and any recommendations for small gardeners who are not diligent at thinning? Oh, I'm terrible at thinning. Which is why the Jang works really well for me. But I think trying to then be like mindful of your spacing. I think that's hard with like really little seeds. That can be really, really difficult. But maybe if it's your turnips and you don't really want to thin them, maybe you're just going through and taking some out to eat, you know, or like making like a fresh like turnip salad, or kind of eating those little baby greens. And then that's a way where like you're getting something, but you're also thinning out your plants. There is also the earth way. I think like some people love the earth way and can like work it really well. It wasn't something that I was able to use well, but I've heard from farmers, you know, once they found someone on their staff that works really well at using a certain thing, then that's the person who just does that thing, and other people don't, because they found this person that works really well. So maybe it's just really kind of finding what works well for you. And again, it took me a while before I made that leap to invest in the Jang cedar, but I felt that in the long run, it would be worth it.
Great, thank you. I have one final question, very quick. You had some images of one slide with 3 images. You mentioned they came from a book. Was that the Farmer's Almanac? I'm just asking because Linda's asked twice about the book already. I want to make sure she gets her answer.
I'll show this one. I don't think it came out of this book. This is the Organic Gardener's Handbook, but I'm pretty sure that it's by the same author, which is Frank Tozer.
Great, thank you.
They have good books, and I would just, you know, look up the author's name, and I think it has like a red cover or something.
Cool. Thank you so much, Samaria. This was such a great presentation. I'm sure everyone enjoyed it. We had so many questions and so many people interacting. It was fantastic. Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for coming. You're getting some comments already in the chat box. I was going to ask if you have any volunteer opportunities up and running now with Growing Power. Sorry. Oh my goodness, Dreaming Out Loud. Sorry, confused with Chicago. If you have any volunteer opportunities now, feel free to share them with us. I'm sure a lot of our master gardeners would be interested in helping you out at the farm.
Okay, yeah, it's we're there every Wednesday and Friday from 10 to 3 for open volunteer hours. And then if you're interested in herbalism, we do herbal mutual aid work every Friday between like 3 and 6. We're having a pop-up there July 30th where we'll be giving out, you know, free herbal medicine, plants, you know, a whole bunch of things. There'll be a swap, a bunch of stuff going on that day.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. Great opportunities. Cool. Thanks everybody for coming. Have a great night.
Thank you.